Grease never truly washes off. It settles into the deep creases of your knuckles, hides beneath the cuticles, stains the whorls of your fingerprints, until your hands carry a permanent record of every meal you ever cooked. Harlan Cruz had stopped trying to scrub it out somewhere around year 4 of running the diner. By year 15, he had stopped noticing it entirely. It was just part of him now, like the scar that bisected his left eyebrow, or the dull throb in his lower back that announced itself every morning around 4:30, reliable as an alarm clock, impossible to silence. He pressed the heavy iron spatula down on a thick slab of bacon, listening to the violent hiss of fat rendering against the flat-top griddle. The sound filled the kitchen the way familiar sounds always do in the early morning, not as noise, but as texture, as atmosphere, as proof that the world was still turning in the direction it was supposed to turn. The smell was dense and suffocating and deeply comforting. Cured pork black coffee, the faint chemical bite of the bleach he used to wipe the counters before dawn. The smell of Cruz Diner, the smell of the last 15 years of his life. Outside, the Nevada sky was the color of old pewter. A thin, miserable drizzle dragged itself across the desert, the kind of rain that didn't clean anything, that just made the dust stick differently. The secondary highway that ran past the diner's front window was empty at this hour, a gray ribbon unspooling into nothing in both directions, bordered by scrub brush and the occasional rusted fence post leaning at a defeated angle. No interstate, no truck stops with their neon promises. Just the highway, the rain, and the hand-painted wooden sign above the door that read Cruz Diner in letters that had been fading since the Clinton administration. It wasn't a destination. It had never been meant to be. It was a place you ended up when your fuel gauge dipped into the red, or when the glare off the asphalt gave you a migraine that made the interstate feel like a punishment. The kind of place that existed in the margins of the map, serving the people who traveled the margins of everything else. Long-haul truckers running secondary routes to avoid way stations. Ranch hands driving 2 hours for a hot meal that wasn't cooked on a camp stove. The occasional lost tourist who took a wrong turn somewhere outside of Elko and decided to make peace with it. Harlan flipped the bacon with a practiced, economical motion. His thick fingers moved around the hot griddle with the unhurried confidence of someone who had done the same thing so many thousands of times that it had ceased to be an action and had become simply a reflex. A piece of muscle memory burned so deep it required no conscious thought whatsoever. He was 68 years old, and his hands knew this kitchen the way they had once known entirely different things. He preferred not to think about that. The bell above the front door made its sound. Not a jingle, a clank, a dull, heavy sound like a dropped wrench, which was fitting because Harlan had salvaged the bell from a defunct auto shop in Winnemucca and bolted it above the door himself, and he had never bothered replacing it with anything more pleasant. The sound suited the place. It suited him. He didn't turn around. He moved the eggs to the cooler side of the griddle, adjusted the flame under the coffee urn, and listened to the boots on the linoleum. One set. Heavy, flat-heeled work boots with a particular rhythm of a man carrying real weight, not just body weight, but the accumulated weight of miles. Harlan recognized the sound without needing to see it. Virgil Foss lowered himself into the corner booth with the careful deliberation of a man whose knees had been arguing with him for the better part of a decade. He was 55, built broad and soft around the middle, wearing a flannel shirt under canvas suspenders and a gimme cap from a diesel parts supplier that had gone out of business 4 years ago. His face was the color of old saddle leather, deeply lined around the eyes, from years of squinting through windshields at flat horizons. He drove a refrigerated long-haul rig for a produce distributor out of Reno, and his route brought him past this stretch of highway 3 times a week, which meant that over the past 9 years, Virgil Foss had consumed approximately 1,400 cups of Harlan's coffee and never once complained about the quality of any of them. Harlan poured a mug without being asked and set it on the counter's pass-through shelf. Virgil collected it on his way to the booth, nodded once in acknowledgement, and opened a copy of a trucking industry newspaper that looked like it had been read several times already. This was the routine. This was what mornings at Cruz Diner looked like. Quiet, predictable. A particular kind of peaceful that Harlan had spent a very long time constructing, brick by careful brick out of the rubble of the life he had walked away from. He cracked 4 eggs onto the griddle and watched the whites go opaque. His lower back throbbed. He ignored it. The truth about Harlan Cruz was a thing he carried the way a man carries a chronic injury, always present, sometimes flaring, never fully healed. He had been born Harlan Eugene Cruz in Bakersfield, California, the third son of a mechanic who believed in hard work and harder drinking in that order. He had learned to ride a motorcycle at 14, left home at 17, and by 23 had found the kind of brotherhood that a man raised on chaos and neglect finds irresistible. The kind of brotherhood that asks everything of you and gives back something that feels like belonging until the day the bill comes due and you realize what you actually traded for it. He had been the enforcer for a Hells Angels chapter out of Reno for 19 years. The title was not ceremonial. It meant that when the club had a problem that required a particular kind of solution, Harlan was the solution. He had been very good at his job, good enough that his name had circulated in certain circles in a way that made men adjust their plans when they heard it. Good enough that a small rectangular patch had been sewn onto his vest over his heart, the kind of patch that was not bought or requested but earned through the kind of acts that put men in federal prisons for a very long time. The patch read "Filthy Few." Then came the night outside of Sparks, Nevada, a confrontation between chapters that escalated past the point anyone had intended. Harlan had been there. He had done what he was called upon to do. And afterwards, sitting in a county jail cell with cracked ribs and a broken orbital bone staring at the water-stained ceiling and listening to the sound of the facility at 3 in the morning, something had shifted inside him. Not remorse exactly. Something quieter and more permanent than remorse. A recognition. A cold, flat understanding that he had been feeding something inside himself for 2 decades, and that the thing he had been feeding was hollow, and that the feeding would never stop unless he stopped it himself. He served 4 years. When he came out, he bought a failing roadside diner on a stretch of Nevada secondary highway with the money his mother had left him, and he became Harlan the cook. He traded the Harley panhead for an industrial flat-top griddle. He traded the leather cut for a stained white apron. He traded the brotherhood of men who communicated through violence for the solitude of a man who communicated through bacon and eggs and strong coffee, and the willingness to keep his mouth shut and mind his business. 15 years, not one incident, not one phone call from the old world, not one request, not one obligation, not one knock on the door in the dead of night. He had built the walls high and the silence deep, and the silence had held. He plated the eggs and slid them through the pass to Virgil without ceremony. Virgil folded his newspaper and ate with the focused efficiency of a man on a schedule. The rain tapped against the front window. The coffee urn hissed softly. Somewhere in the kitchen, a fly moved against the fluorescent light with a dry, papery sound. This was the life, small and quiet and entirely his. He didn't hear the car pull up because the rain masked the engine noise, and the first indication he had of new arrivals was the bell above the door making its dead metallic clank. 3 sets of boots hit the linoleum, and the sound was wrong immediately. Not work boots, sneakers. Expensive ones, the kind with dense rubber soles that squeaked against damp flooring, with every step a high-pitched, obnoxious sound that grated against the diner's quiet, like a fingernail drawn slowly across a chalkboard. Harlan glanced over his thick shoulder. They were young, early 20s at the oldest. The one in front wore a puffy nylon jacket in electric blue, the kind designed more for appearance than warmth, that rustled loudly with every movement of his arms. His hair was cut close on the sides and longer on top, pushed back with some kind of product that had dried stiff. He was good-looking in the way of boys who had been told so too often, which had given him a looseness around the jaw, a permanent half-smirk that he deployed the way some men deploy a handshake, automatically reflexively, before any actual information has been exchanged. His name, Harlan would learn later, was Colt Marsh. The two flanking him were a study in imitation. They wore their clothes and carried their bodies with the exaggerated, wide-shouldered swagger of men performing a version of toughness they had assembled from screens rather than from experience. The one on the left was heavy-set, smelling strongly of synthetic marijuana and cheaper cologne. The one on the right was thinner, sharper-eyed, and more alert, which in Harlan's experience made him the more dangerous of the two, because alert and foolish was a worse combination than dull and foolish. They slid into the two booths nearest the register. They didn't sit normally. They sprawled, draping their arms along the backs of the red vinyl seats, taking up twice the space a person actually needs. The physical grammar of boys performing dominance for an audience that in this case consisted of one tired trucker and an old man with a spatula. Harlan turned back to the griddle. The Colt slapped his palm flat against the counter. The sound was loud and sharp and entirely deliberate, designed to produce a flinch to establish from the first moment that the terms of the interaction were his to dictate. Harlan scraped a thin layer of grease into the catch trap with the corner of his spatula. He did not flinch. He did not turn around. "You got a menu, old man." Harlan reached under the counter and set 3 laminated single-page menus on the surface without turning around. He heard one of them get picked up, flipped over, set back down. "Smells like a grease fire waiting to happen in here." Colt said it pleasantly, as though making conversation, as though the observation carried no barbs whatsoever. The two flankers made sounds of amusement. Harlan wiped his hands on his apron and turned around. He looked at Colt the way he looked at the griddle every morning, without judgment, without reaction, as a surface he was required to manage. His face was a landscape of accumulated weather. Deep lines carved by the road, by sun, by the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from working too hard, but from carrying something too long. His nose had been broken 3 times and had never quite reset straight. His beard was gray and coarse and hadn't been trimmed recently. His eyes were pale blue and entirely without effect, the eyes of a man who had seen too much of a particular thing to find any version of it surprising anymore. "Coffee," he said. Colt looked back at his friends and grinned. The grin was for them, not for Harlan. It said, "Watch this." It said, "This is going to be easy." "Sure, pour us some coffee pops." Harlan poured 3 mugs. The glass pot was heavy, and the arthritis in his right wrist sent a sharp complaint up his forearm as he tilted it. He set the thick ceramic mugs on the counter without saucers. No ceremony. Colt didn't touch his mug. He leaned forward on his elbows and looked around the diner with the practiced assessment of someone taking inventory. "This is a nice little setup," Colt said. His voice had dropped a register, leaning into an approximation of menace that was technically correct in its components but hollow at the center, the way a cover version of a song can have all the right notes and none of the feeling. "Quiet location. Out of the way. But you know how it is out here in the sticks, right? Things happen. Windows get broken. Wiring shorts out. Pipes freeze, and nobody notices until the damage is done." Harlan began wiping the counter with a damp rag, tracing slow, methodical circles over the faded laminate. He kept his eyes on the rag and his expression completely neutral. He had heard this speech before. He had heard it in 4 different states in 3 different decades from men whose ages ranged from 19 to 60. The cadence was always the same. The false concern layered over the demand. The implication dressed up as neighborly advice. It was a small and unoriginal form of predation, and the men who practiced it always believed they had invented it. "I don't have trouble," Harlan said quietly. "Everybody has trouble eventually," Colt replied, settling deeper into his performance. "We represent a kind of community protection, a neighborhood watch you could call it. We make sure places like this stay safe." He paused for effect. "For a small monthly contribution, of course." Harlan folded the rag. He set it on the counter with deliberate care and walked back to the griddle. He felt the temperature in the room change behind him, the way the atmosphere thickens when a social script fails to produce its expected result. The boys had come in with a structure, a sequence of moves that were supposed to produce fear, then compliance, then cash. Harlan's indifference had jammed the sequence, and now the machinery was grinding. "Hey!" Colt's voice had hardened. The pleasantness was gone, and what was underneath it was younger and less controlled than what had been above it. "I wasn't asking you a question, old man. I'm telling you how things work out here." I heard you, Harlan said. He pressed the spatula down on the bacon. Virgil Foss had stopped eating. Harlan didn't need to look to know it. He could feel the shift in the room's weight distribution, the trucker's sudden stillness in the corner booth. Patience in Harlan's experience was the first casualty in men performing toughness. They could sustain the performance for a certain duration, but indifference, not defiance, not argument, just simple, undramatic disregard, eroded the performance faster than anything else. Because the performance required an audience, required a reaction, required the other person to play their assigned role in the script. When that person simply refused, the performer had two choices: escalate or retreat. Boys who had never actually been punched in the mouth almost always escalated. Colt stood up. The squeak of his expensive sneakers on the wet linoleum was violently out of place, a small, absurd sound in a moment that was gathering weight. He walked to the counter and picked up the heavy glass sugar dispenser. He held it for a moment, looking at Harlan's broad back. Then he turned it upside down. The white crystals cascaded out in a soft, hissing stream, piling up on the dirty tile floor, like snow spreading across the linoleum in a slow white radius. The sound was almost peaceful, almost delicate. The two flankers watched from their booths, their postures shifting from sprawl to attention, leaning forward now, sensing that the moment was about to change shape. "Maybe you need to look at me when I'm talking to you," Colt said. "Hey!" Virgil Foss's voice came from the corner. It was a big voice, rough and flat, the voice of a man who spent most of his time alone and chose his words accordingly. "Leave the man alone. He told you he's not interested." The heavy-set one off Colt's left turned immediately. He crossed the diner in 4 strides and shoved Virgil hard in the chest with both hands. Virgil was a big man, but he was sitting down and off balance, and the force caught him sideways. He went over the edge of the booth seat, his shoulder, and then his elbow slamming into the floor with a dense, ugly thud, his coffee mug hitting the tile beside him and shattering into a dozen heavy ceramic pieces. Virgil grunted and lay still for a moment, blinking at the ceiling. Something clicked off in Harlan's chest. Not rage, not adrenaline. Something quieter and more absolute than either of those things. A door closing, a gear engaging, the long, carefully maintained stillness of 15 years cracking along a fault line that had always been there waiting. He didn't vault the counter. He didn't execute anything that could be described as graceful. He was 68 years old with a torn rotator cuff in his left shoulder and knees that ground like dry bearings on cold mornings and ribs that ached on rainy days for reasons he had never had officially diagnosed. He reached across the counter and picked up the heavy ceramic coffee mug, Colt's untouched mug, still full, still hot. And as Colt turned his head toward the sound of Virgil hitting the floor, Harlan swung it in a short, compact arc. The mug connected with the bridge of Colt's nose. The sound was sickening, a wet, hollow crunch, the dense ceramic shattering against cartilage, scalding black coffee exploding across Colt's face and jacket in a wide, dark spray. Colt's head snapped back and he staggered, his hands flying to his face, blood welling instantly between his fingers, in thick, dark lines pouring freely down over his chin and the collar of his electric blue jacket. His scream was high and ragged and stripped of all pretense, the raw sound of a boy who had never actually been hurt before encountering the reality of it for the first time. The other two froze. That fraction of a second, that arrested moment when trained bravado crashes headlong into actual physical consequence, and the nervous system seizes up trying to reconcile the two, was the only window Harlan had, and he knew it. He came around the counter, moving toward the thin, sharp-eyed one, his right arm leading. But the window closed faster than his body could move through it. His bad shoulder failed him on the pivot. He was a half-second slow. The heavy-set one, the one who had shoved Virgil, had recovered from the initial shock and lunged across the counter from the other side. A fist caught Harlan above the left cheekbone with a dense, flat impact that sent a white flash across his vision and buckled his knee. He grabbed the edge of the prep table with both hands and held himself up, his vision strobing, the kitchen tilting briefly before it steadied. Then the thin one vaulted the counter entirely. A boot caught Harlan in the ribs, left side, third and fourth, and the sound was not something he wanted to hear again. a dense pop of bone giving way. The air evacuated from his lungs in a single wet wheeze, and his legs went out, and he hit the kitchen floor hard his shoulder, and then his hip, taking the impact in sequence. They were on him before he could get his arms up. He curled inward, tucking his chin to his chest forearms up to protect his head elbows pressed together. The boots found his thigh, his lower back, his shoulder. He absorbed them. He had been beaten before badly by men who knew what they were doing, and these boys did not know what they were doing, which was its own particular danger, because men who don't know what they're doing don't know when to stop. He stayed small and waited and breathed in shallow sips, because deep breathing was no longer an option. Above him, the destruction was audible and systematic in the way that destruction always is, when it's driven by wounded ego rather than purpose. He heard the heavy crash of the glass pie case being shoved from the counter, the sound of it hitting the floor and shattering into 1,000 pieces, the crystalline scatter across the tile like sudden ice. He heard the register being torn open, the cheap spring-loaded drawer giving way with a metallic shriek, coins spilling and rolling in all directions. He heard the espresso machine, the one piece of equipment he had splurged on, the one thing in the diner that cost real money being struck with something heavy. The pressurized water line snapping hot steam, hissing into the kitchen air in a dense white cloud that collected on every surface and ran in thin rivulets down the stainless steel. The scalding mist settled on the exposed skin of his forearms. He kept his eyes closed. Crazy old bastard. Colt was screaming, his voice thick and wet and muffled by the blood filling the back of his throat. Smash it, all of it. Smash everything. Harlan lay on the floor and listened to his diner being taken apart. He focused on breathing. In shallow, the left side screaming at him with every fraction of an inch. Out. A dead moth lay near the floor drain, its powdery wings pressed flat against the wet grime of the tile, perfectly still in the chaos around it. He fixed his eyes on it. He breathed. He waited for the noise to spend itself. Then the footsteps changed. They were moving toward the door. He heard Virgil's booth squeak, the trucker pulling himself upright, making for the back exit. The sound of a man removing himself from a situation that was no longer his to manage. Harlan didn't blame him. There was no percentage in staying. Colt's footsteps stopped near the pass-through. His ragged, blood-choked breathing was loud in the damp, hissing kitchen. And then from somewhere very close, Harlan heard the sound of a phone being dialed. Not a quick text. A call connecting, ringing once. "It's done," Colt said. His voice was low now. The performance was entirely gone, stripped away by pain and adrenaline, and what was underneath it was different. Not the swaggering boy, but something younger and more obedient, the voice of someone reporting in. He didn't have much, maybe $60 in the till. A pause, he listened. "No, it's not burned, you said not to. Just roughed up." Another pause. His voice dropped lower, almost apologetic. "Yeah," he pushed back. "It got messy." Then nothing. The call ended. Harlan lay on the floor and did not move. He cataloged what he had just heard with the careful, unhurried precision of a man who had spent a significant portion of his life paying close attention to what other men said when they thought no one dangerous was listening. This had not been spontaneous. Someone had sent these boys. Someone had given instructions. Someone who knew enough to specify not to burn it, which meant someone who had a different use for this building, this land, this particular stretch of highway, than a pile of ash and insurance paperwork. The front door opened. The bell made its dead metallic clank. Footsteps moved across broken glass. Then the door closed and the sound was gone, and there was nothing but the hiss of the broken water line and the thin, cold drum of rain against the shattered front window and the distant sound of an engine fading down the highway in the direction of Elko. Harlan waited. He lay on the floor of his ruined kitchen for a long time after the sound of their car had completely dissolved into the rain. He waited until the only sounds were the water and the slow drip of something finding the floor through the broken window and the high, thin hiss of the steam losing pressure. Then he rolled onto his hands and knees. The pain in his left side was breathtaking, and total a jagged thing that redefined itself with every millimeter of movement, finding new registers of sensation he hadn't known were available to him. He gritted his teeth against it. A low sound escaped him that he hadn't intended. He grabbed the edge of the prep table and dragged himself upright. His legs held, barely. His left eye was swelling shut, the skin gone tight and hot, the peripheral vision on that side narrowing to a slit. He stood in the wreckage of his kitchen and looked at it under the flickering fluorescent light. The pie case was gone, reduced to a sparkling field of glass shards across the tile. The register hung open like a broken jaw, a few dollar bills soaking in a spreading puddle of syrup that had dripped from a shattered bottle on the shelf above. The espresso machine was a crumpled ruin, the broken water line still hissing its slow diminishing complaint, a puddle spreading across the rubber floor mats and finding the grout lines between the tiles. The salt and pepper shakers, the napkin dispensers, the condiment bottles, all of them swept off the counter, scattered broken soaking. He pressed a dish rag against his split lip. He did not reach for the phone behind the counter to call the police. The police asked questions. The police ran names. Harlan's actual name, the one attached to a social security number and a set of fingerprints in a federal database, was a thing best left unexamined. He had rebuilt himself out of 15 years of silence and deliberately undistinguished paperwork. And even now, even standing in the ruins of what that silence had built, he was not willing to light a match to it just to let a county sheriff take a report that would go nowhere. He limped toward the back of the kitchen. Every step was a renegotiation with his own body, his left side presenting its full accounting of the evening's damage with each footfall. The heavy wooden door to the back office was closed, and his hand shook slightly as he fumbled for his keys. The shaking wasn't fear. He recognized the tremor, the receding edge of an adrenaline surge, the body's chemical bookkeeping tallying up what had just been spent and presenting the invoice. The lock clicked. He pushed the door open. The office was barely larger than a generous closet. A cot against one wall, a metal desk scarred by years of coffee rings, and the occasional burn mark from a pipe he had given up a decade ago. The air was stale and smelled of old paper and cedar, and the faint ghost of that pipe tobacco, a smell that clung to the walls long after the source was gone. And in the far corner, shoved against the baseboard, a heavy iron-bound footlocker with a thick padlock that had rusted to the color of dried blood. Harlan didn't go to the cot. He didn't sit at the desk. He lowered himself into the desk chair, the springs groaning their own complaint, and he let his head fall back against the headrest. And he stared at the water stains on the ceiling tiles, and he breathed, and he thought. He thought about what Colt had said on the phone, the specific language. It's not burned, you said not to. Whoever was on the other end of that call had a plan for this building that didn't include destroying it, which meant the roughing up was pressure, not punishment. A softening, a loosening of the ground before you drove in the stake. He thought about the highway outside. 15 years ago, when he had bought the diner, this stretch of Nevada, 278, was as close to nowhere as a man could reasonably get while still having access to running water. In the past 3 years, he had noticed things accumulating around the edges of his quiet life. A survey crew spending 2 days in the scrub brush west of his property line. A county assessor's truck parked out front one morning, the driver writing something on a clipboard and driving away without coming inside. The slow, quiet way the land adjacent to his, the failing cattle operation to the north, the abandoned mining claim to the east, had changed hands with very little public notice and even less fanfare. He had noticed all of it. He had filed it away the way he filed everything, with the automatic, unconscious categorization of a man trained to read environments for threat. But he had told himself it was nothing. He had told himself he was being paranoid. He had told himself that his particular tendency to see patterns and assign them sinister weight was a survival reflex from a life he no longer lived, misfiring into the harmless landscape of bacon prices and coffee inventory. Now he sat in his office listening to rain and steam and the irregular drip of water, and he reconsidered that assessment with the cold clarity of a man who has just had 15 years of careful reasoning kicked out from under him. He stood. His ribs ground together and the left side of his body registered its complete and sustained objection. He walked to the corner of the office, crouched with careful effort beside the iron footlocker, and reached under the desk for the heavy pair of bolt cutters he kept there for no reason he had ever articulated to himself, a piece of old instinct that had insisted on being kept within reach despite 15 years of not being needed. The padlock resisted. He applied the bolt cutters and leaned his weight into the handles twice. The third time, the hardened shackle gave with a sharp metallic snap that rang in the small office like a gunshot. He pulled the broken lock free and set it on the floor and opened the heavy lid. The smell was immediate and entirely specific and completely bypassed the thinking part of his brain, going directly to the older, deeper parts where certain things are stored not as memories, but as physical responses. Old motor oil, sun-cured leather, road dust that had been sitting undisturbed for 15 years, and something beneath all of that, a mineral animal smell that was the compound residue of sweat and exhaust, and long miles ridden at night with cold air cutting against your face, and the engine beneath you doing the only honest work you'd ever known. The smell of his life before this one. He reached in and lifted out the cut. It was heavier than he remembered, or perhaps he was simply weaker than he had been. Heavy denim, the sleeves hacked off at the shoulder seams decades ago, the fabric marked by grease and road grime, and darker stains that he didn't examine closely in the dim office light. He turned it over. The back patch was intact. The large winged death's head bold and unambiguous. The top rocker curving over it in crimson letters, Hell's Angels. The bottom rocker with the territory. And above the left breast, the small rectangular patch in worn red and white. Filthy few. Harlan sat on the edge of his cot with the vest across his lap. He ran his thumb over the heavy embroidery of the death's head, the threads worn at the tips of the skull's teeth, but still vivid, still carrying their color with an obstinacy that felt personal. The colors hadn't faded the way he had hoped they might. Time had preserved them intact, which felt like an editorial comment from somewhere he didn't care to examine. He sat there for a long while with the weight of the leather across his thighs, and the sound of the rain on the diner's metal roof, and the distant, diminishing hiss of the broken water line, and the old smell filling the small room. Then he reached across the desk and pulled the black rotary phone toward him. The plastic casing was cracked and the dial was stiff from disuse, and it had not been touched in the entire time he had occupied this office. He had kept it connected because disconnecting it would have required an action, a decision, a moment of deliberate severance that he had never been quite willing to perform, had always deferred to another day that he had always expected would never arrive. The number existed nowhere that could be found by anyone looking for it. It was burned into the architecture of his memory alongside the dates his closest friends had died, and the exact sound a panhead engine made on a cold Nevada desert highway at 3 in the morning. Things that don't fade because they are not stored as information, but as identity. He didn't need to look it up. He put his thick index finger in the dial. The rotary clicked heavily with each number snapping back with a sound that was entirely from another era, a mechanical sound that belonged to the version of him that had spent his life in that other era. It rang 3 times, a slow, heavy analog trill that sounded out of place even in the silence. Someone picked up. The background held the sound of a television playing at low volume and the weight of a man who had been asleep for several hours. A rough voice. Yeah. Harlan's throat was tight. He swallowed. He tasted blood old and copper familiar. It's Harlan, he said. The television sound disappeared. A pause. Long enough that Harlan could hear the other man's breathing change sharpen, push the sleep entirely out of itself, and come to full attention. When the voice came back, it carried 2 things running alongside each other. A deep, unhurried respect, and the careful caution of a man receiving information he has not been certain after 15 years that he would ever receive. Harlan. A pause that held its own weight. It's been a long goddamn time, brother. We thought you were a ghost. Outside, the rain intensified briefly, drumming hard against the metal roof of the diner before easing again into its thin, persistent drizzle. Harlan looked down at the vest in his lap. He traced the arc of the top rocker with one thick, grease-stained finger following the curve of the crimson letters from one end to the other and back again. He said quietly, but I need the boys to ride out. Somebody just woke me up. He set the phone down. He sat in the dark office with the vest across his lap and the broken lock on the floor and the ruined sounds of the diner filtering through the closed door. And he waited. He was not angry. He was not frightened. He was something older and simpler than either of those things, a man who had made a decision and was now on the other side of it, waiting for the consequences to arrive. Somewhere to the east, on a highway that cut through the dark Nevada desert in a straight gray line toward Reno, heavy engines were already turning over in the cold night air. The vibration reached the cracked linoleum before the sound did. A low, sub-audible tremor that moved through the concrete foundation and up through the floor and into the soles of Harlan's boots as he stood behind the ruined counter. It was the kind of vibration that had once been as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, and even after 15 years of deliberate silence, it registered in his body before his mind had time to name it, producing a response that was neither memory nor instinct, but something between the two, a physical recognition that existed below the threshold of thought. He had wrapped his torso tightly while he waited. A thick cotton dish towel folded into a pad over the broken ribs, silver duct tape wound firm around his midsection 3 full passes. It wasn't medical care. It was structural reinforcement, the same principle as bracing a cracked beam. It wouldn't heal the damage, but it would hold the architecture together long enough to get the work done. His left eye had swollen to a narrow operational slit. The cheekbone beneath it had a density and heat that suggested something cracked, though he had no particular interest in official confirmation of that suspicion. He stood in the dark diner and listened to the vibration build into sound. The headlights came first yellow and piercing through the rain-streaked glass of the front window, sweeping across the wreckage of the dining room in long arcs as the vehicles turned off the highway and into the gravel lot. Then the sound arrived in full, no longer a vibration, but a physical presence. The deep, overlapping thunder of multiple large displacement V-twin engines running in loose formation. It filled the night in the diner and Harlan's chest simultaneously and did not apologize for doing so. The engines cut one by one. The silence that followed was not quiet. It rang. Boots on wet gravel. 5 sets heavy and unhurried. Then the crunch of broken glass as they came through the open frame of the front door, the door itself hanging at an angle where Colt's friends had wrenched the upper hinge partially free on their way out. They didn't step around the debris. They walked through it, their engineer boots grinding the remnants of the pie case into fine powder, moving through the destruction without comment. Taking inventory, the way men take inventory of damage when they have seen enough of it to no longer require a reaction. Dex Pruitt came through first. He was 65 and he wore every year of it in the surface of his face, which had been carved by wind and road and the metabolism of a life lived mostly outdoors and mostly at full commitment into a landscape of deep lines and hard angles. His beard had gone entirely white since Harlan had last seen him, and he wore it long tied off near the bottom with 2 small rubber bands. A heavy silver chain ran from his belt loop to his wallet, worn smooth by decades of daily contact. His cut hung open over a black thermal shirt, revealing the dense faded tattoo work that covered his throat and disappeared into his collar. Old enough that some of it had blurred at the edges, the ink migrating slightly into the surrounding skin the way old ink does. His eyes were very dark and held the particular stillness of a man who has long since stopped being surprised by what the world puts in front of him. Behind Dex came Tommy Creel, built like a commercial refrigerator, and carrying the scarred, hairless scalp of a man who had made his peace with that situation sometime in his mid-30s. He was smoking a cigarette burned to nearly nothing, holding it between 2 thick fingers with the absolute economy of a man who had been smoking in confined spaces for 30 years and had refined the practice to its essential minimum. Behind Tommy came 3 others younger, their faces less fully written by time, their cuts bearing fewer patches, but the same fundamental gravity. Dex stopped in the center of the ruined dining room. He stood with his hands loose at his sides and turned slowly, taking in the slashed vinyl seats. The open register, the demolished espresso machine, still leaking its slow puddle across the kitchen floor. The field of broken glass that caught the flickering fluorescent light and scattered it in 1,000 small, bright directions. His jaw was set into a hard, unforgiving line. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he found Harlan in the shadows behind the counter. He looked at Harlan's face, the swollen eye that had reduced itself to a slit. The careful, shallow way Harlan was holding his torso, the slight forward lean that a man with broken ribs unconsciously adopts to reduce the torque load on the damaged side. Dex looked at all of it without expression. He did not offer pity because pity between men who have shared the kind of history they shared was a particular kind of insult, a reclassification of the other person into someone who required managing rather than standing beside. He reached into the interior of his canvas jacket and produced a pint bottle of rye whiskey. He unscrewed the cap with his teeth, spit it onto the floor without looking where it landed, and held the bottle across the counter. Harlan took it. The glass was warm from Dex's body heat. He drank a long, deliberate pull, and the rye went down like battery acid, finding a crack and settling into it with a burning, necessary warmth. He handed it back. "3 of them," Harlan said. His voice had settled into something flat and stripped of inflection, the voice he used when he was reporting facts rather than speaking from any particular emotional position. Young, early 20s, the one in the blue jacket took the coffee mug to the nose. He's the one who made the call afterward. He paused. He reported to someone when he thought I was done. Older voice. Gave instructions before it happened. Said don't burn it. Dex turned the pint bottle in his hands once a slow rotation. You know where they went. They've been through before. Not often. They buy from a trailer operation near the old Callahan copper mine 4 miles south on the access road. They'll be there tonight, celebrating $60 in what they think they did to an old man. One of the younger members standing near the far end of the counter let out a short, flat laugh. Dex silenced it with a single backward glance that required no words and left no room for misinterpretation. The younger man found something to look at on the wall behind him. Dex looked at Harlan steadily. You know who made the call? Not yet, Harlan said, coming around the end of the counter, moving slowly, favoring his left side with the careful economy of a man managing a fixed budget of movement. But one of the boys in that trailer does. Dex nodded a single downward motion that carried the finality of a decision already made before the words were finished. He looked at Tommy Creel. Bring the truck around. Tommy dropped the burned remnant of his cigarette on the wet floor and walked back out through the broken doorframe without a word. He was good at receiving instructions and acting on them without embellishment, which was one of his most valuable qualities. Dex turned back to Harlan with the particular attention of a man assessing not the damage to a body, but the condition of what was operating behind it. You got your gear, he said. Harlan walked back through the kitchen to the office without answering. The footlocker sat open with its broken lock on the floor beside it, and the vest was where he had left it on the cot. He stood in front of it for a moment in the dark office, with the old smell still present in the room, less overwhelming now than it had been when he first opened the lid, settling into the background, the way familiar things settle. He picked it up. He worked his good arm through the right armhole first, then contorted carefully to get the left side over his damaged shoulder, the torn rotator cuff sending its familiar complaint up the column of his neck. The leather settled onto his shoulders with a weight that was specific and unmistakable, the weight of something shaped over decades to fit a particular body and no other. He walked back out into the kitchen. He didn't need to see their faces change to know that they had. He felt it, the reorganization of the room's attention, the particular quality of stillness that forms around a piece of significant information. The younger members registered the back patch first, then the filthy few tag over the heart. Their postures straightened into something more considered, more careful than what had been there a moment before. They were looking at something they had heard about in certain kinds of conversations, referenced in the way that things are referenced, when the person speaking wants the listener to understand they are talking about history that carries weight. Now, the history was in the room with them, wearing its credentials on its back. Dex looked at the vest, then at Harlan's face. He gave one slow nod that meant everything it needed to mean. They went outside. The rain had thinned to a cold mist that collected on every surface and ran in thin lines down the leather and the chrome of the 5 Harley-Davidsons, parked in the gravel lot in their staggered formation, their exhaust pipes ticking as they cooled in the damp air. Behind them sat Tommy Creel's truck, a heavy-duty pickup in primer black with a cracked windshield and tires that communicated serious intent. The engine running the cab interior smelling of cigarettes and old coffee when Harlan pulled open the passenger door and climbed in. The door shut with a heavy metallic sound. Harlan braced his right hand against the dash as he settled into the seat, managing the movement carefully so it didn't ask more of his left side than it could currently provide. Tommy put the truck in gear. Outside, Dex straddled his Road King and kicked it to life, the engine catching with a bark that settled into a steady rolling thunder that Harlan felt in his back teeth. The others followed in sequence. The lot filled briefly with sound and blue exhaust before the convoy pulled out onto the wet highway, heading south, running without headlights for the first stretch, navigating by the gray moonlight, bleeding through the cloud cover in thin diffuse sheets. Harlan stared through the cracked windshield at the wet road. The cold tire iron between the seats was present the way a sound in another room is present, acknowledged, not yet relevant. His stomach was tight with a dread he recognized from other nights. In other decades, the dread of a man who knows what he is capable of and does not entirely trust himself in the presence of the conditions that have always activated it. He had told himself 15 years ago that he was done with this. He had meant it completely and without reservation. And yet here he was, and the fact that the provocation had been genuine and the reasons were sound did nothing to change the fundamental shape of what the night had become. The access road to the old Callahan mine turned off the highway at a rusted cattle guard a quarter-mile past a collapsed fence line. Tommy killed the headlights at the cattle guard. The bikes had already gone dark 100 yards back. They rolled the last stretch in near-total blackness. Tires crunching softly on wet Calichet engines dropped to a barely audible idle that was more felt than heard. The mine was a skeleton. Corrugated tin on bare steel frames, most panels gone, or hanging damaged, the remaining ones banging softly in the night wind. The conveyor infrastructure rusted to an orange so deep it looked black in the moonlight. The tailings ponds were perfectly still, their surfaces carrying a chemical sheen that held the diffuse light in thin, iridescent lines. The whole site carried the sharp mineral smell of ground that had been excavated and abandoned to its own chemistry for 30 years. At the far edge of the property, 3 single-wide trailers clustered around a packed dirt central area. A late-model pickup, a compact car with a cracked taillight, a motorcycle under a tarp. From the largest trailer, orange light bled around the edges of a sheet-covered window, and the thin, distorted bass of music on a cheap Bluetooth speaker pushed through the aluminum walls and dissolved into the wet air. Tommy parked behind a mound of slag. The bikes arranged themselves in a silent line without instruction, each rider cutting the engine in sequence until the complete silence came back. Dex appeared at the driver's window. Tommy rolled it down. 3 of them inside, Harlan said quietly, his breath coming white in the cold air. The one with the broken nose is mine. The other 2, I just need them seated. Dex looked at him steadily. You sure about yours? Harlan held his gaze. I'm sure. Dex unhooked the leather-wrapped sap from his belt and turned to the group, making 2 economical gestures with 2 fingers that sent 2 of the younger members moving silently wide around the slag mound toward the back of the trailers. He and the remaining member took the left flank. Harlan got out of the truck. The cold mud took his boots with a soft sucking pressure at each step. He buttoned the top 2 brass snaps of his cut over the duct-taped torso and walked straight up the center of the packed dirt yard with unhurried, deliberate steps. He didn't try for quiet. He wanted them to feel the approach before they understood what was approaching, to have one moment of nameless unease before the name arrived. He reached the aluminum door. The music was audible now, vibrating the frame at the bass frequencies. Voices beneath it, the overlapping loose talk of young men in the register of post-adrenaline ease, reliving the evening, talking over each other. Harlan raised his boot and kicked the door at the latch. The aluminum tore free of the frame with a shriek of separating metal, the door slamming inward and rebounding off the interior wall hard enough to crack the cheap wood paneling. The music stopped. Not turned off, interrupted. The speaker knocked from its surface, the connection broke in mid-note. The interior was a narrow room with a torn floral sofa at its center, a pressed wood coffee table bearing the evidence of the evening beer cans, a handle of cheap whiskey at the halfway mark, a food container with flies despite the cold. The air was thick and close, carrying the compound smell of stale smoke and spilled beer, and the particular warmth of bodies in a small sealed space. Colt Marsh was on the sofa. He was holding a blood-soaked rag against the lower half of his face, head tilted back against the cushion, eyes half closed. The electric blue jacket was off, crumpled on the floor beneath the coffee table. Its front soaked a deep rust brown, where the coffee and blood had dried into each other. Without the jacket, he looked younger and considerably more fragile. His face above the rag was swollen around both eyes. From the impact, the nose a distorted purpled mass. The dried evidence of recent crying was visible on his cheeks above the crusted blood. The heavy-set one and the thin, sharp-eyed one were in the narrow galley kitchen, caught mid-motion, bottles in their hands, bodies going rigid with the crash of the door. For one full second, nothing moved. Harlan stepped into the weak light of the single floor lamp. The leather creaked. He stood in the doorway and let the light find the patches on his chest and back, and he watched the information arrive in the room and do its work. The thin, sharp-eyed one got there first. His eyes moved from Harlan's bruised, asymmetrical face down to the death's head on the chest, the crimson lettering of the top rocker, the worn red and white of the filthy few patch. He read it the way a man reads a sentence he knows, but hoped not to encounter in this particular paragraph. The bottle in his hand slipped. He caught it, and the sound of his grip tightening on the glass was audible in the sudden complete silence. The color left his face in a single rapid withdrawal, leaving behind a chalky, sick grayness that had nothing performed about it. "Oh, Jesus," he said. The words had almost no air behind them. The heavy-set one looked at the thin one's face, then at Harlan, then back at the thin one's face, and the same information arrived in him 3 full seconds later, but with identical effect. Then Dex came through the front door, the remaining member behind him. From the back of the trailer, the rear door opening, the 2 younger members stepping into the kitchen from behind, boxing in the heavy-set one and the thin one against the cabinet fronts. The trailer filled with men who occupied space differently than the boys had been occupying it, with a weight and a stillness that reorganized the room's entire geometry. Dex produced the heavy-barreled revolver from his waistband and held it loosely at his side. Not aimed, not brandished. Present in the way that certain things are present. Tommy Creel filled the door frame behind Dex, his sheer physical bulk making an exit through that opening a theoretical rather than practical proposition. Colt's architecture came down, not gradually, all at once. The whole scaffolding of it and what was underneath was just a 23-year-old boy with a broken nose and a face that hurt, and the sudden complete understanding that he had catastrophically miscalculated the nature of the evening's work. His shoulders fell, his hands, which had begun to rise from the sofa cushions in some vestigial gesture toward defiance, fell back. His knees buckled and he sank deeper into the cushions, and the bloody rag dropped from his fingers onto the coffee table. Harlan walked forward. Every step was pain and none of it appeared on his face. He stopped directly in front of Colt. "You broke my pie case," Harlan said. His voice was barely above a whisper. It was not theatrical. It was not constructed for effect. It was the voice of a man who had arrived at the irreducible minimum of what needed to be said and had stopped exactly there. In the closed space of the trailer, it cut through the silence cleanly. Colt looked up at him. His eyes were filling not with bravado or calculation, but with something much more fundamental and much less controllable. "Man," His voice broke on the word. He swallowed and started again. Man, please, we didn't know. We didn't know who you were, I swear to God. It was supposed to be easy, just go in and lean on the guy, get him to think about selling, and the voice was dissolving into breathless, hiccuping speech, the body's attempt to cry overriding the mind's attempt to prevent it. Take the money back. It's right there on the table. Take all of it. Take whatever you want. We didn't know, please. I don't care about the money, Harlan said. The words landed in the room with a weight that was entirely disproportionate to their simplicity. Because they were true, and because in the context of what was actually present in that trailer at that moment, the truth of them was far worse than any amount of concern about $60 would have been. It meant the money was not the measure of anything. It meant Harlan was measuring something else entirely, and Colt knew it, and the knowing of it had taken the last of the structural support out from under him. Harlan reached down and took hold of Colt's shirt with his right hand, gathering the fabric and pulling the boy to his feet in a single motion. Colt came up crying openly, making no effort to manage it, his hands moving uselessly in the air between them. Harlan pulled the boy's face close to his own. You talk about protection, Harlan said, quiet and almost gentle. You walk into a man's place, the thing he built with his own hands over 15 years, and you use it to shake him down. He paused, letting the words stand alone in the room with nothing around them. You're not protection. You're a parasite. You make a living bleeding people who build things. Colt was shaking with a full-body tremor he had no control over whatsoever. Harlan looked at him for a long, level moment. Then he reached down with his left hand and took Colt's right wrist, the hand that had upended the sugar dispenser, the hand that had started all of this, and brought it to the edge of the coffee table. He pressed the forearm flat against the pressed wood surface and held it there. Colt understood what was coming before it came. He began to beg in earnest, the words collapsing into each other. Please and no. And I'm sorry, running together into a single breathless stream that filled the trailer without punctuation. His two companions in the kitchen had turned their faces away against the cabinet fronts. Harlan brought his boot down on the center of Colt's pinned hand. The small bones of the hand are numerous and close together, and they do not withstand that kind of direct compression without consequence. The sound they made was dense and final, and was over in less than a second, but would take months to fully undo. Colt's voice left him entirely for a fraction of a second. The sound that replaced it was breathless and airless, a pure reflex of the nervous system with no voluntary component at all, before his voice returned and the sound became full and ragged and filled the small trailer completely. He collapsed to the floor and curled around his hand, drawing it to his chest, his whole body contracting around the injury in the ancient biological posture of serious damage. Dex stepped forward and drove the butt of the revolver into the heavy-set one's stomach, folding him over the kitchen counter without ceremony. The thin, sharp-eyed one pressed himself flat against the cabinet and did not move and required no further attention. Listen carefully, Dex said, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone who has never required volume to be heard. He did not raise it now. Both of you, get out of this county before sunrise. If either of you are within 200 miles of that diner when the sun comes up, we will come back. And what happened tonight will look like a courtesy call. A pause. Nod if you understand what I'm telling you. Both of them nodded, the heavy-set one from his bent position over the counter still trying to locate his breath, the thin one against the cabinet nodding rapidly and repeatedly, unable to stop. Harlan looked down at Colt on the floor for a moment. He felt the hollow emptiness that had always followed these moments settling back into its old familiar place. He had forgotten that part. He had spent 15 years forgetting it, and now it was back, and it was exactly as he had left it. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Just the vacancy where feeling should have been the quiet aftermath of something that solved the immediate problem and solved nothing else. He turned and walked out through the broken door. The cold air hit his face, and the mist collected on his beard, and the mud took his boots with each step, and he walked to the truck and leaned his back against the rusted quarter panel and closed his eyes. He breathed in the small, careful increments his ribs would permit. He counted the inhalations and let them pull him back from the place his mind was trying to visit. He heard the others come out, the sounds of men and motorcycles. From inside the trailer, Colt's sounds were quieter now, intermittent, exhausted. Dex came and leaned beside him against the truck. He produced cigarettes lit, one held the pack toward Harlan. Harlan shook his head. They stood in the cold mist, without speaking for a moment. "You did what the situation required," Dex said. He exhaled smoke into the dark air above them. "You know that." "I know," Harlan said. "A wolf gets one free bite and you do nothing. The whole pack is on you by next week. That's not philosophy. That's just arithmetic." "I know," Harlan said again. He turned his hands over in the cold air and looked at them. The trembling was gone. What remained was the grease in the knuckles and the old scars and the familiar hollow feeling and the question of what came next. "Doesn't mean I have to enjoy the taste of it." Dex smoked in silence. "Then the call the kid made. You get anything from it?" "Enough." Harlan pushed off from the truck and moved toward the passenger door. "Someone planned this. The kid said don't burn it. They want the building, the land under it." He reached for the door handle. "Someone with a plan that has more steps in it than three boys in a trailer." Dex looked at him over the roof of the truck, his dark eyes steady in the bad light. "You want us to stay?" Harlan thought about it. He thought about the survey crews and the assessor's truck and the quiet way the adjacent land had changed hands. He thought about the older voice on Colt's phone, unhurried, and directive, the voice of a man who had given those instructions the way a man gives instructions to someone he employs. "Not tonight," he said. He pulled open the truck door. "Tonight I just need to get back." They drove out of the mine site the way they had come, lights off until the highway, the bikes falling into formation behind the truck on the wet asphalt. The convoy ran south for a few miles before Dex pulled alongside the truck, tapped the horn once, and the bikes peeled west at a junction, their taillights dwindling in the rain until they were red pinpoints and then nothing at all. Tommy drove in silence. He was exceptionally good at silence, which was one of his best and most consistently useful qualities. Harlan watched the highway and thought about the voice on Colt's phone. He reached into his coat and produced the electric blue jacket he had taken from the trailer floor on his way out, an automatic, unhurried collection performed without conscious decision. Old habit operating below the level of deliberate thought. He went through the pockets methodically with one hand while Tommy drove. A lighter, a crumpled 20, a stick of gum still in its wrapper, and a business card. He turned it over in the cab's dim light. Heavy cream-colored stock. Clean professional printing, Ray Spade, Spade Land and Holdings, an Elko address. Below the name in smaller type, principal and managing partner, managing. Behind the card, folded twice into a small rectangle, was a piece of notepaper. Harlan unfolded it. The handwriting was compact and even each letter formed with the economy of a man accustomed to writing things down efficiently. The address of Crew's Diner written out in full. And below it in the same hand, "Soften him up. Don't burn it yet." Harlan sat with the notepaper in his hands and the business card on his knee, and the Nevada highway running past the windows in the dark, in the slow rain, and he read both items twice. Then he set them face down on the seat beside him and looked at the road ahead and let the shape of what he was looking at fully assemble itself. The land, the highway corridor, the adjacent parcels that had changed hands quietly, the survey crews, the assessor, and in the center of all of it, still frying bacon at 4:30 every morning, entirely unaware that he was sitting on something that someone with resources and patience had decided he needed. Harlan Crew, 68 years old, bad back, bad shoulder, broken ribs, and 700 square feet of formica and cracked vinyl on a piece of Nevada desert that Ray Spade had written instructions about on his personal notepaper. Tommy pulled into the gravel lot and left the engine running. Harlan climbed out and stood in the wet gravel and listened to the truck reverse out and the engine fade north. Then he went inside, walked through the dark, ruined dining room with the broken glass crunching under his boots, went to the office, sat on the edge of the cot, and took the vest off with careful difficulty and set it on the desk. He lay back and stared at the ceiling and thought about what came next in a sequence like the one Ray Spade had constructed. He thought about it with the patient, unhurried clarity of a man who has no choice but to think clearly. When the rough approach fails, you come yourself. You come with a suit and a reasonable voice, and an offer that is framed as rescue. You make sure the man across from you understands, without your saying anything that can be written down, that the offer is the better of the available options. And you time your arrival to catch him when he is tired and damaged and surrounded by the evidence of his own vulnerability. Harlan closed his eyes. His ribs ached. His face ached. His shoulder ran its sustained complaint from socket to skull. Ray Spade would come in the morning. He knew it with the same certainty he knew the grease was in his knuckles, and the back pain would be there at 4:30. Some things were simply the next step in a sequence that had already been set in motion. He let the night move past him and waited for what he already knew was coming. The morning came in the way Nevada mornings come, after a night of rain, slowly and without commitment. The light arriving not as illumination, but as a gradual reduction of darkness. The gray sky going from black to charcoal to old pewter, without ever resolving into anything brighter or warmer. Harlan was awake before it. He had not slept deeply enough for sleep to mean much had moved instead through the shallow territory between rest and wakefulness, where the mind keeps processing even when the body has given up trying to stay alert, turning things over, examining them from different angles. He sat on the edge of the cot and breathed carefully. The ribs had stiffened overnight, the way damaged tissue always stiffens the body, building a wall of inflammation around the site, reducing mobility in exchange for a crude and temporary stability. He pressed 2 fingers gently against his left side and felt the tenderness that confirmed 2 ribs, possibly 3. Not life-threatening, significantly inconvenient. The kind of damage a younger man heals from in 6 weeks, given adequate rest, which the current situation was not going to provide. He stood, peeled the duct tape away in one long strip, replaced the cotton pad from the kitchen supply, and rewrapped his torso tighter than the night before, working methodically and without self-pity. His left eye had graduated overnight from swollen to spectacular, a deep purple-black crescent that consumed most of the upper cheek and reduced vision on that side to a functional slit. He washed his face at the small utility sink. He looked at himself in the narrow rectangle of mirror above it and took an honest inventory of what he saw. He had looked worse. He had looked worse many times. On most of those occasions, the next morning had required him to go to work regardless, and he had gone and the work had been done. He walked out into the kitchen and stood in the wreckage and looked at it in the gray morning light with the eyes of a man making a list rather than a man feeling sorry for himself. The pie case was gone. That was a phone call to Winnemucca. The espresso machine was destroyed. That was an expense with a price attached, which meant it was solvable. The register needed a new drawer mechanism. The front window needed glass. The door needed its hinge reset. The floor needed sweeping again and then mopping. These were problems with solutions. He could work with problems that had solutions. He started the drip coffee on the secondary machine. He found the push broom and began working through the broken glass pile by pile, moving slowly and letting the broom do the work rather than forcing it. The harsh scraping of ceramic and glass on linoleum was the only sound in the empty diner. And it was not a pleasant sound, but it was a purposeful one. The sound of a man moving through damage rather than sitting in it. He was on his second cup of coffee and the floor was mostly navigable when he heard the car. Not a truck, not a motorcycle. A car with a smooth, nearly silent approach of something expensive and properly maintained, pulling into the gravel lot with a deliberateness that was its own announcement. The gravel crunched with measured precision under the tires. The engine shut off cleanly. One door opened and closed. Harlan set his mug on the counter. He leaned the push broom against the wall. He stood behind the counter and waited. Ray Spade came through the damaged front door, the way men who are accustomed to walking into important rooms walk through damaged ones, as though the damage were a feature rather than evidence of anything that required acknowledgement. He was 54 years old, and built like a man who had been genuinely athletic in his youth and had maintained enough of the underlying structure to carry the additional weight of comfort and success without looking soft. He wore a charcoal suit over a shirt the color of good cream collar, open no tie. His hair was silver and cut close, his face clean-shaven and evenly bronzed. He wore leather-soled shoes that had no business on the wet gravel of a Nevada secondary highway, but carried their incongruity without apology, the way things carried by men who are accustomed to being wherever they choose to be. He looked around the diner. His expression performed a practiced neutrality, acknowledging the reality of the damage while declining to be troubled by it, the face of a man communicating that he has seen worse and remained unbothered by that too. His eyes found Harlan. He smiled. It was technically a good smile, warm at the corners, reaching the eyes by just enough to be credible. The smile of a man who had built significant portions of his professional success on his ability to make the person across from him feel in the first 30 seconds that they were in the presence of someone who genuinely had their interests at heart. "Mr. Cruz," he said. His voice was even and pleasant, a well-maintained baritone calibrated for rooms with good furniture. "I heard you had some trouble last night. I wanted to come by personally and express my concern." Harlan looked at him and said nothing. Spade walked to the nearest stool and rested one hand on its back, not sitting, just establishing proximity, claiming a portion of the space as his own. He looked at Harlan's face, the destroyed eye, the split lip, and produced an expression of sympathetic distress, assembled from the correct components, but built on the wrong foundation. "That looks painful," he said. "Have you seen a doctor?" "What do you want?" Harlan said. Spade tilted his head slightly, accepting the directness as a personal stylistic preference rather than a rebuff. He reached inside his jacket and produced a business card, setting it on the counter with the placement of a man making his first deliberate move. Harlan recognized the card. He had the original in his shirt pocket taken from Colt's jacket the night before. "My name is Ray Spade. I'm a land and property developer based in Elko. I've been working in this corridor for a few years, acquiring properties along this stretch of the 278 for a development project I'm not yet at liberty to fully detail, but which represents a significant economic investment in this part of the state." He paused, letting the language settle. "I've had my eye on this particular parcel for some time. It's good land, Mr. Cruz, better than you might currently appreciate." Harlan picked up the business card between two fingers, regarded it briefly as though seeing it for the first time, and set it back down on the counter. "I'm not selling," he said. Spade nodded as though this were the expected opening position and not a conclusion. "I understand that, and I'm not here to pressure you. I want to be clear about that. What happened here last night?" He gestured at the damaged room with one hand. "That's a terrible thing. Senseless. And I think any reasonable man in the aftermath of something like this asks himself whether this is still the right situation, whether the investment of rebuilding makes sense given the location, given the—" "Who sent those boys?" Harlan said. The smile stayed. It was a very good smile, and it had been specifically constructed to remain intact under direct questioning. "I'm not sure I follow what you mean." "Yes, you are." Something moved behind Spade's eyes. Not guilt. Guilt wasn't what lived there. Calculation. The rapid practice assessment of a man determining what the other person knows, what they can demonstrate, and what the gap between those two things looks like from a legal and practical standpoint. He had been in enough rooms to recognize when someone across from him had something. The question was always whether what they had was a card worth playing or a bluff worth calling. He let the smile ease into something more candid, not honest in the sense of truthful, but honest in the sense of dropping one layer of the performance while maintaining everything beneath it. "Mr. Cruz," he said, "let me speak plainly. You're a man who has built something here over a long time. I respect that genuinely. What I'm offering is a way for you to leave this on your own terms with real money in your pocket, rather than continuing to operate a business that is honestly in a declining corridor, increasingly difficult to insure," and he paused, allowing the pause its full weight, "increasingly difficult to protect." There it was, delivered without a fingerprint on it, the way that certain men deliver certain things, wrapped in enough layers of plausible alternative interpretation that the threat within it was technically deniable, but utterly impossible to miss if you were paying attention. Harlan had been paying attention to this kind of language for most of his adult life. He felt the note card and the business card in his shirt pocket and thought about what he knew and what Spade believed he knew and the exact dimensions of the gap between those two positions. "You should go," Harlan said. Spade held his gaze for 5 full seconds, establishing that the departure would proceed on his schedule. Then he straightened, smoothed his jacket, picked up the business card, and placed it again an inch closer to Harlan's side of the counter. "Think about it," he said pleasantly. "The offer is generous. It won't remain open indefinitely." He looked at the damaged room one final time. "I hope you feel better, Mr. Cruz." He walked out. His city shoes crunched on the wet gravel with measured precision. The expensive car turned in the lot with unhurried control and pulled back onto the highway, heading north toward Elko. Harlan stood behind his counter and listened to the sound of it dissolve into the gray morning distance. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out the note card and the business card and set them side by side on the counter and looked at them in the flat morning light. "Soften him up. Don't burn it yet." The handwriting of a man accustomed to giving instructions that other people carried out. He understood now the full architecture of what he was facing. This was not three boys in a trailer celebrating $60. This was a man with resources and patience and legal relationships and almost certainly county-level connections that made conventional confrontation worse than useless. The boys had been a deniable opening move separated from Spade himself by one clean degree. The visit this morning had been the second move plausibly coincidental, plausibly concerned its threat so well wrapped it would survive scrutiny. The subsequent moves would escalate in the same pattern, maintaining deniability at each step, until Harlan sold, or until something happened to the building that could be attributed to the general hazards of operating aging commercial property on an isolated secondary highway. Calling Dex back was not the answer. Spade had the county sheriff Harlan had read it in the man's composure, the ease of someone who has no reason to be concerned about local law enforcement because he isn't. Bringing the club in meant bringing men with records into a situation that would be framed around them rather than around Spade. Dex could face charges. The club could end up under investigation. And Harlan's real name, the one attached to a federal database, and 4 years in a Nevada correctional facility would surface, and everything built under the cover of 15 years of quiet would come apart at once. He needed something that operated in the same register as Spade's leverage. Documented, attributable, something that Spade could not dismiss or outlawyer in the time available. He was still thinking about this when he heard the second vehicle of the morning pull into the gravel lot. A truck this time. He recognized the engine's particular rhythm before it stopped a sound he had been hearing pull in 3 times a week for 9 years. The door opened and closed with the flat, graceless sound of a vehicle that had too many miles on it to close smoothly anymore. Virgil Foss came through the damaged front door wearing the same flannel shirt and canvas suspenders from the day before, his face carrying the specific texture of a man who had not slept and was not attempting to present any version of himself that suggested otherwise. The bruise on his left forearm from where he had hit the floor when the heavy-set kid shoved him was visible below the rolled cuff of his shirt, a dark oval that he was carrying in plain view without any attempt to cover it. He looked at Harlan. He looked at the swept floor and the push broom and the drip coffee on the secondary counter. He sat down on the stool at the far end of the counter, the stool he never used, always taking the corner booth, always maintaining the same geography of habit that had characterized 9 years of mornings in this room, and the deliberateness of choosing the wrong seat announced that what he had come to say would not fit comfortably inside the usual routine. Harlan poured him a coffee without being asked. Virgil took the mug in both hands and looked at the counter surface for a long time. Not the easy silence of 9 years of shared early mornings, but the effortful silence of a man building towards something he has been carrying long enough that the carrying has become its own separate burden on top of the original weight. "I owe you something," Virgil said. Harlan waited. "I've been running this route for going on 10 years, Virgil said. He spoke with the deliberate care of a man who doesn't use words carelessly as a general practice and was applying extra care now. In that time, I've had a lot of conversations in here about the highway, about the land out this way, about what's changing and what isn't. Coffee counter talk, the kind of talk you don't think of as information because it doesn't feel like anything important when you're having it. He looked up. His eyes were direct and carried a steady, unhurried quality of regret. About a year and a half ago, a man found me at the fuel stop in Carlin. Said he was doing economic research for a commercial development project in this corridor. Said he was trying to understand traffic patterns, business viability, how things worked out here. Virgil looked back at the counter. I told him about this place, about how busy it gets in certain seasons, about the traffic, about how long you've been here. He stopped. I know now that was Ray Spade's people. Harlan held his mug without drinking. He kept his expression even and looked at Virgil steadily. I didn't know, Virgil said. I want to be absolutely clear about that. I was having a conversation at a fuel stop and I didn't know I was being mined. But that doesn't change what I gave them. He reached into the front pocket of his flannel shirt and produced a folded piece of paper, setting it on the counter with the care of a man setting down something he has been carrying carefully for some time. 6 months ago, when Earl Deschamps's place east of here went to Spade Holdings, Earl's widow gave me a copy of the contract. Said something about it felt wrong, but she'd already signed and didn't know what to do about it. I held on to it because it bothered me, and I didn't know what to do with it either. He pushed the paper toward Harlan. I think it belongs with you now. Harlan unfolded it. A photocopy of a land purchase contract, 2 pages, the standard-looking kind of document that is designed to look standard. He read it slowly, without rushing past the parts he didn't immediately follow, going back over clauses until their meaning was clear. He was not a lawyer. He had never been close to one. But he had spent 19 years operating in environments where the gap between what an agreement said and what it meant was frequently enormous and consequential. And that experience had given him a sensitivity to that gap that formal legal training didn't always provide. He found it on the second page, buried in the third subclause of the section on easements and access rights language that described a perpetual rights-of-way clause, giving Spade Holdings irrevocable access across the purchase parcel for any infrastructure project within a defined corridor, without limitation of scope and without additional compensation to the seller or their successors. The kind of clause that a person signing a straightforward land sale would read past without registering its significance, particularly if they were elderly or trusting or in financial distress, which described most of the people who had been selling to Spade Holdings along this stretch of highway over the past few years. Not necessarily illegal on its face. The legality depended on questions of disclosure and informed consent that required expertise to adjudicate. But it was the kind of clause that anyone who understood it would have negotiated away or refused, and its presence in a contract with a 70-year-old widow suggested that her full understanding of what she was signing had not been Ray Spade's primary concern. Harlan folded the contract and held it for a moment. Earl Deschamps's widow, she still have the original, lives in Wells, Virgil said. Full executed copy. She'd talk to you. Harlan set the folded contract on the counter beside the note card and the business card. 3 pieces of paper. He aligned them parallel to each other with the edge of his index finger, a precise, unconscious motion. He looked at them. He thought about what they were and what they weren't. The note card put Spade in a supervisory relationship to the boys who had destroyed the diner, but it was found in Colt's jacket, and Spade's lawyers would dismantle the chain of custody in 20 minutes. The Deschamps contract was suggestive of a predatory pattern, but required expert analysis to establish anything actionable. Together, they told a story. But stories required an audience willing to hear them, and the audience that mattered, the county sheriff, was not by all indications willing. He was not going to the police. That had not been an option at any point in this sequence, and it remained not an option. He was not going to a lawyer because lawyers moved in time frames and through frameworks that had never been designed with men like him in mind, and could not be made to move faster. He was going to race Spade. The decision arrived not as a conclusion, but as a recognition of something that had already decided itself at a level beneath deliberate thought. He had spent 15 years avoiding the version of himself that walked directly at problems rather than around them. He had told himself the avoidance was wisdom. He had told himself the version of him that walked directly at things was the dangerous version, the one that had cost years of his life and had left permanent marks on other people's lives as well. But Ray Spade had come into his diner in a good suit, with a calibrated voice, and had threatened him with the elegant, deniable fluency of a man who had done the same thing many times before, to people less equipped to recognize it for what it was. And there was a version of what happened next in which Harlan took the money and found another stretch of highway and built another quiet life out of the same materials. He could see that version clearly. It was available to him. He looked at Virgil. "I need you to do something." Virgil met his eyes without hesitation. "There's a man named Dex Pruitt," Harlan said. "I'm going to write down a phone number. Tomorrow night, if you haven't heard from me by 10, I need you to call that number and tell the man who answers that Harlan said to open the envelope." He paused. "Can you do that?" Virgil looked at him with the steady, unlabored attention of a man who has encountered enough of the world's genuine texture over 55 years to not be easily disturbed by what it contains. "Yes," he said. Harlan wrote the number on the back of an order ticket and slid it across the counter. Then he spent the rest of the morning doing what he could with the repairs, a piece of plywood over the broken front window, the door hinge reset with hardware from his toolkit, the floor swept again and mopped twice, a list of replacement equipment called into the supplier in Winnemucca. He worked slowly and steadily, using the physical rhythm of it to keep himself from sitting still with his thoughts, which were running in a direction he had decided and did not need to revisit. When the light began its early disappearance from the gray Nevada sky, Harlan went into the office and changed his shirt. He put on the cleanest one he had. He folded the note card and the business card into the breast pocket. He looked at the vest on the desk for a moment, the filthy few patch facing up, and then left it where it was. He drove into Elko. The 40-minute drive on wet asphalt under a sky that had given up on rain without committing to clearing gave him time to think about Ray Spade with a clarity and specificity that sitting still in the diner had not quite allowed. He thought about the voice behind Colt's performance unhurried directive in possession of a plan. He thought about what it meant to be a man who sent his son to do something his son was not equipped to do, and what it said about how that man thought about his son. He thought about the Duchamp contract in The Widow and Wells and the quiet patience of someone who had been working this corridor for years without anyone connecting the pieces. He thought about the last time he had walked directly at a problem rather than around it, and he thought about what it had cost, and he thought about the 15 years he had spent in the aftermath of that cost, and what those years had built, and why the building of them had mattered to him. He thought about the diner sitting empty and damaged on the secondary highway, and he thought about getting up at 4:30 every morning for 15 years, because the getting up was what it meant to have chosen the life he had chosen. And he thought about what it would mean to let someone take that from him without walking directly at it with everything he had left to walk with. He stopped at the post office before it closed. He sent a padded envelope to a Reno address he wrote from memory, an address that had not changed in 20 years because certain things do not change. Inside a copy of the Duchamp contract, the note card in its original form, and a single sheet of paper with 3 sentences explaining the context, ending with, "If I don't call by 10 tomorrow night, you know what to do." He sealed it, sent it priority, received a tracking number, and put the tracking number in his shirt pocket. He drove to the hardware store and bought a new padlock for the footlocker. He knew he would not use it. The buying of it was a different kind of act, a private acknowledgement of something he had been pretending for a long time, a gesture that made sense only to the person making it and did not require any witness. He ate a sandwich in the hardware store parking lot with the engine running for the heat, watching the early evening Elko streetscape without seeing it. The gray commercial buildings, the wet sidewalks reflecting the streetlights in long yellow smears, people going about the ordinary business of an ordinary evening, none of whom knew or needed to know that a 68-year-old man with broken ribs and a destroyed eye was sitting in a truck in their parking lot with a padlock he wasn't going to use on the seat beside him, thinking about what it meant to be exactly what you are. He drove to the Spade Land and Holdings building. It occupied the second floor of a professional building 3 blocks from the county courthouse. 4 other tenants listed in the lobby directory, all of them dark at this hour. The elevator was operational. Harlan took the stairs, his left side registering each step with its familiar, sustained commentary, which he acknowledged and continued past. The second-floor corridor was fluorescent lit and smelled of commercial carpet and recycled air. Suite 214 had frosted glass in the door and the company name in clean sans-serif lettering. A light was on behind the frosted glass. Harlan had considered the possibility that Spade would not be here at this hour and had determined it was not a significant possibility. Men who moved the way Spade moved did not maintain regular hours. They worked when the work required it, which was often in the evenings when the official apparatus of the day had wound down and the informal one was still running. He tried the handle. Unlocked. He pushed the door open and walked through the empty reception area and through the partially open inner door. Ray Spade was behind a wide desk of dark wood jacket hung on the back of his chair. Sleeves rolled to the elbow, a spread of documents before him, and a glass of amber at his elbow. He looked up. The surprise on his face lasted approximately 2 seconds, a full second less than it would have taken most men to recover. Then the composure returned with the practiced ease of someone who has reclaimed composure in difficult situations many times and has refined the process. "Mr. Cruz," he said, "I didn't expect you this evening." "I know," Harlan said. He crossed the room and sat in one of the chairs across the desk, without waiting for an invitation, lowering himself into it, with the careful management of a man with broken ribs who will not allow the pain to appear on his face, because allowing it to appear changes the geometry of the room. He reached into his breast pocket and removed the note card and placed it on the desk, turning it so the writing faced Spade. Spade looked at it. He looked at the compact, even handwriting. He looked at the address of Cruz Diner and the 7 words below it. He picked it up and examined it with the careful attention of a man verifying whether what he is holding is what he believes it to be. He set it down. He looked at Harlan. "Where did you get this?" he said. "From your son's jacket," Harlan said. Something moved in the deeper registers of Spade's expression. Not the composure which held. Something beneath it in the parts of a face that are harder to govern. He looked at the note card again, then at Harlan. "That's not," he started. "Your handwriting," Harlan said. "On your note paper, with your son's fingerprints on the back of it alongside mine, which establishes that both of you were connected to my diner on the evening it was destroyed." He paused. "I also have a copy of the contract you used to acquire the Duchamp property east of here. The rights-of-way language in Section 4, Subclause 3. He let that land. "Copies of both are with someone I trust, not the police. Someone who will act on them if I don't check in by 10 o'clock tomorrow night." Spade sat with the full weight of his attention directed at Harlan, the pleasantness entirely set aside now, what remained being the actual man underneath all of it. Intelligent, careful, practiced at finding the structural weakness in opposing positions and working it with patience until the position gave way. He was looking for the weakness here, and Harlan could see him looking and could see the moment he recognized that the search was going to take longer than he had time for. "You're not going to the police," Spade said. It was not a question. "No," Harlan said. "Then what you have is leverage, not evidence," Spade said. "And leverage depends entirely on the credibility of the person holding it. A man with your particular history, Mr. Cruz, bringing documents forward that implicate a prominent local." "I'm not bringing anything forward," Harlan said. "I'm sitting in your office at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night having a conversation." He looked at Spade with the pale blue eyes that held the same undramatic vacancy they had always held the eyes of a man who has been to the place this kind of conversation eventually arrives at and has made a separate peace with what he found there. I've done things that would put me in a cage for whatever years I have left. I made my peace with that a long time ago. It means I don't have a future to protect. He allowed a moment of silence to do its work. You do. The room held the silence. Spade's amber glass sat untouched at his elbow. The documents on his desk, whatever transactions and plans they represented, lay in the lamplight, with the patient indifference of paper waiting to matter. Spade looked at Harlan for a long time. Then he reached for his phone. "I'm going to call the sheriff," he said. "Okay," Harlan said. He did not move. Spade held the phone. He looked at the note card on the desk. He thought about what Harlan had said about the person holding the copies. He thought about the 11 words of handwriting on the note card handwriting that was in fact his own. He thought about the Duchamp contract and the easement language in subclause 3, and what a motivated examination of that language by the right person with the right knowledge would produce. He thought about his son's broken hand and where that information currently lived and who else might have access to it. He set the phone down. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two men who have arrived at the part of a negotiation where the positions are visible to both sides and the language of concealment has been formally set aside. Harlan had sat in this silence before in different rooms with different men, and he had learned that the only way to be in it was to be in it fully, to make no move to fill it, to let it work, to let the other man find his own way to where the silence was leading him. Spade picked up a pen. He pulled a sheet of paper from the desk drawer and wrote on it with the efficient brevity of a man drafting something he has already thought through. He wrote for 2 minutes without looking up. Then he slid the paper across the desk. 7 lines. Spade Land and Holdings withdrew all current and future interest in the parcel containing Cruz Diner on Nevada, 278. No further contact, direct or indirect, would be initiated regarding said property. Dated. A line for signatures. Spade signed it and slid it back across with the pen balanced on top. "I want the note card back," he said, "and I want your word that the copies don't move." Harlan read the document twice fully without hurrying. He picked up the pen. "The copies stay where they are," he said. "Not as a threat, as insurance. Your word holds, they hold." He looked up. "If anything happens to my property or my business or to me, they move." Spade held his gaze for a measured moment. "Agreed." Harlan signed the document. He folded his copy and put it in his breast pocket. He left the note card on the desk. He stood up from the chair with the controlled care of a man managing a specific physical debt, straightened his shirt, and looked at Ray Spade one final time. Spade was looking back at him from behind the desk with the expression of a man who has just paid more than he intended to pay and has decided that the payment, while excessive, was less expensive than the alternative, and has made the calculation quietly and without visible distress. Harlan turned toward the door. He had his hand on the frame when Spade's voice came from behind him. "Colt is my only son." Harlan stopped. He stood in the doorway with the corridor's fluorescent light coming in around him, and his hand on the frame, and the cool, recycled air of the building moving past him. 3 words that carried none of the calibration or polish of anything else Spade had said in the past hour. Just the plain bare weight of a fact offered by a man who was underneath the suit and the composure and the accumulated machinery of 15 years of leveraging other people's vulnerabilities. Still a father who had sent his son to do something his son was not built for and was now sitting with the full accounting of what that decision had cost. Harlan did not turn around. "Tell him to find a better line of work," he said. He walked out. The corridor was empty. He took the stairs down with one hand on the railing, managing the descent carefully. He walked through the lobby and out through the glass front door and into the Elko night, which had cleared completely during the hours he had been inside the rain. Entirely gone, the sky above the city salted with stars in the particular density that only appears in the high desert after a thorough weather system has moved through and left the air completely clean. His breath came white and visible in the cold. His boots sounded on the pavement with an even unhurried rhythm. He sat in his truck for a while before starting it. He was not in a hurry, and he recognized that he was not in a hurry, and he sat with that recognition for a moment. He held the signed document in his hands and looked at it in the cab's interior light. 7 lines. His name and Spade's name and the date and the thing that was now formally over. He folded it carefully and put it in the glove box. Then he started the engine. He called Virgil from the road. The phone rang twice. "It's Harlan," he said. "You can stand down." A pause. "You all right?" "I'm all right," Harlan said. He drove the 40 minutes home on the empty highway under the cleared sky, the headlights reaching out ahead of him into the Nevada dark, showing the scrub brush and the fence posts and the flat, pale asphalt in a long corridor of light. He thought about very little. He let the road be what it was, and the night be what it was, and let the truck carry him without requiring anything from him beyond the mechanics of driving. He thought once about Ray Spade sitting behind his wide, dark desk with the note card in front of him, and the signed document gone, and the amber glass still untouched at his elbow. He thought about Colt Marsh somewhere in the county, or out of it, nursing a broken hand, and the end of an evening that had gone entirely differently than he had been told it would go. He thought about what it meant to be someone's only son, and to have that someone send you to do work you were not made for, and whether the boy had understood yet what his father had actually been asking of him. He thought about the note card and the signed document, and the Duchamp contract, and the envelope in Reno, and all the pieces of paper that had passed through his hands in the past 3 days. And he thought about how different this was from how he had once solved problems. And he thought about whether different meant better or just different, and he decided that in this case it meant both. The diner came into view ahead of him, the plywood over the front window pale against the dark building, the repaired door visible in the headlights, the gravel lot wet and empty. He pulled in and parked and sat for a moment looking at it through the windshield. It looked like what it was, a small damaged building on a secondary highway that nobody came to by accident, that offered nothing spectacular, and delivered nothing beyond hot food and strong coffee, and the quiet company of a man who had decided 15 years ago, and again every morning since, to be a man who cooked rather than a man who did other things. It was still standing. That was the beginning and the end of the accounting, and it was enough. He went inside. He walked through the kitchen to the back office and stood for a moment looking at the footlocker in the corner, its lid closed, the new padlock sitting on top where he had placed it that afternoon when he got back from the hardware store in Elko. He picked the padlock up. He turned it in his hands, feeling the weight of it, the cold brass of the shackle, the solid click of the mechanism when he pressed it. Then he set it down on the floor beside the locker instead of on top of it. He looked at the vest on the desk. He picked it up and folded it carefully. The back panel folded inward so the death's head faced itself, and he placed it in the footlocker and closed the lid. He didn't lock it. He was finished pretending that a lock was what stood between the two versions of himself, or that the absence of a lock meant the wrong version would get out. The box was what it was, and he was what he was, and the distance between Harlan Cruz, who fried bacon, and Harlan Cruz, who had once done entirely other things, was not a padlock on a footlocker. It was a decision made fresh every morning, the choice of the griddle over the road, the apron over the leather, the quiet over the noise. He had been making that decision for 15 years. He would keep making it tomorrow and the morning after that. And that was not a guarantee, and it was not a conclusion, but it was the truth of how it actually worked, which was more valuable than either of those things. He went to bed. In the morning, he was up before the light in the way that had become so automatic over 15 years, that his body no longer required an alarm and no longer required any negotiation with the prospect of getting up. He unwrapped his ribs and rewrapped them and felt the familiar protest from the left side and continued anyway. He started the drip coffee. He went into the walk-in and took inventory of what remained and determined he could operate on a reduced menu. He unlocked the front door, the new hinge moving cleanly without resistance, and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the highway. The sky was beginning its slow gray transition from dark to pale, the desert visible in the early light as a vast, still, frost-silvered expanse running out in all directions to where it met the sky. The scrub brush carried a thin glaze of white. The fence posts ran their long, straight line toward the horizon without deviation. The highway was empty in both directions, the asphalt still wet from the night's cold, its surface reflecting the first light in long, pale streaks. No traffic, no sound except the thin, clean sound of wind moving without obstruction across open ground. He went back inside. He put the bacon on the griddle and listened to it begin its familiar, violent sizzle, the fat rendering against the flat top and the sound that was the first sound of every morning he had spent in this kitchen. He poured his coffee. He stood at the griddle in the early morning light with the spatula in his hand and the smell of the diner filling the air around him. Bacon and coffee and bleach, and the faint mineral trace of the desert coming in through the gap in the plywood where the window would eventually be replaced. He heard the gravel, a single motorcycle, the deep, unhurried rumble of a road king ridden by someone with no particular schedule to keep. It turned into the lot. The engine idled for a moment. Shut off, boots on gravel. The repair door opened with its new clean motion. Dex Pruitt stood in the doorway the way he had stood in doorways for 40 years, taking the full measure of a room before committing to entering it. He looked at the plywood window. He looked at the swept floor and the operational kitchen and Harlan standing at the griddle. He didn't ask anything. He walked in and set a case of beer on the nearest booth seat. Unremarkable domestic brand, the kind you drank because you were thirsty, and looked at Harlan. Harlan held his gaze for a moment. He nodded once. Dex nodded back. He turned and walked out without a word. The Road King started and made its deep receding thunder down the highway, heading west. And then the sound was gone, and the quiet came back complete and unhurried entirely itself. 20 minutes later, the gravel announced Virgil Foss's rig parking on the far side of the lot. The door opened. Virgil walked in with his trucking newspaper under his arm and his gimme cap on his head and went directly to the corner booth. His corner booth, the one he had occupied 3 times a week for 9 years, and sat down and opened the newspaper. Harlan poured a mug without being asked and set it on the pass-through shelf. Virgil collected it on his way to the booth, nodded once, and began to read. Harlan turned back to the griddle. The spatula felt exactly as it always felt in his hand. Heavy, familiar, worn, smooth at the grip from years of daily use. The metal carrying the faint warmth of the griddle's heat through the handle in a way that he had stopped noticing somewhere around year 3 and had never needed to notice again because his hands knew what to do with it. He pressed it down on the bacon and listened to the sizzle intensify, the fat rendering in the heat, the smell rising and filling the kitchen and the dining room and drifting out through the gap in the plywood into the cold morning air outside. His hands moved over the work with the unhurried authority of 15 years of mornings. They were not the hands of a man who had won something last night. They were not the hands of a man who had lost something either. They were simply his hands doing the work they knew, carrying in their creases and their knuckles and their permanent feint, staining the record of all the mornings he had stood at this griddle and made the same choice he had made every morning since he walked out of a correctional facility in Nevada with his mother's money in his pocket and a decision not yet fully formed, but already gathering weight in his chest. Outside the plywood-covered window, the Nevada desert ran in all directions under a sky that was finally gradually with the slow, reluctant commitment of a high desert winter morning beginning to lighten.